Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Health Leaders Fellowship webinar. I'm Mara Herman, Health Policy Specialist here at the Ecology Center, and I'll be your moderator for today. So here's today's agenda. Currently, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please use the chat box to share it. After our presentation from Alexis and our overview of talking points, we'll have time for questions. Please note today's webinar is being recorded, and material from today's presentation will be available later on this afternoon. So our learning objectives for today are, by the end of this webinar, you should be able to identify various tips for meeting with legislators. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our very own Legislative and Policy Director, Alexis Lisbon, for her presentation on advocacy and lobbying.
Okay. Hi, everybody. As Mara said, this is Alexis Lisbon. I'm the Legislative and Policy Director for the Ecology Center. I'm going to sort of walk you through what it's like to meet with legislators, to educate them on issues, and to do some lobbying, which we'll get to practice next week at our Lansing Day. I've been a lobbyist for the Ecology Center since 2011, but I have about, 30 years of political and policy experience beyond that. So I've been doing this for a very long time. And really, this is just to make it easy for you, let you know that it's not really difficult to lobby your legislators, and just remind you that they work for you. So this should be a fun day next week, and don't be at all intimidated. So let's get started. Power of your voice.
Hey, Alexis. Sorry, but we cannot see your screen at the moment.
Oh, it said share, and I can see it. Hold on. Sorry about that. Trying to figure this out now, because now my button's not coming up. Share. Let's try that again. Is it there now?
Great, thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm a pretty good lobbyist, not really great at technical things. So start off, just start to think a little bit about what political engagement you've done in the past. Have you registered to vote? Did you vote in the last election? Do you know who your U.S. Senator or congressional representative is? Most people know, who the president is. Many people can name their U.S. Senator or their member of Congress, but the numbers go down a lot when you talk about who your state senator and state representative are. And often, most of the policy that really impacts your life will happen at the state level and at your local level. So knowing who your locally elected representatives are is really critical. Political participation in this country has gone up significantly in the last couple of years. It had hit kind of an all-time low, but in 2018, election participation was at record highs across the country. And a new poll this morning actually suggests that we're heading that way again in 2020. 75% of those polled said they would definitely vote in the next election, and 85% of likely voters had said yes, they're going to for sure vote. So this is the year to be involved. So as part of that, with people being more and more involved and politically engaged, and obviously with lots of different messages being disseminated across all sorts of online news sources as well as traditional news sources, people are looking for messengers that they can trust. And so that's why health professionals, and that's why, it's really critical that you all get involved, because people actually listen. So if you look, rating the honesty and ethical standards of people in different fields, nurses are right at the top. 84% have very high honesty and ethical standards rating, and 15% have average. So, you know, of all different professions, and you'll see even the ones below, medical doctors, pharmacists, health professionals are right there at the top. So your voice will be critical as far as legislators listening and also the general public. So since 2005, 80% of Americans have listed nursing as the most trustworthy profession, and that's still going on. All right, so a little bit about the Michigan legislature, just so you know sort of what we're dealing with. Michigan is a full-time legislature, and they're a paid legislature. That means they meet throughout the year. Legislative session is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. There are sometimes meetings on Mondays and Fridays as well, but Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays are when you'll see them actually in session. They do have breaks for, you know, during the summer. They meet less frequently, and then there's, you know, breaks during traditional holidays, and then another break during the opening of hunting season. But otherwise, they are in pretty much full time. The Michigan House has 110 members. Each of them is elected to 2-year terms. The Senate has 38 members, each elected to 4-year terms. Michigan is a state that has term limits. That was passed back in 1990. And so what that means is they have maximum numbers of years they can serve in the legislature. In the House, you have 6 years as your max, which is 3 2-year terms. The senators are limited to 2 4-year terms or 8 years total. These are lifetime term limits. In 2019, we elected new leadership after the 2018 election. The Republicans have control of the legislature right now. Senator Mike Shirkey is the majority leader in the Senate, and Senator Jim Ananich is the minority leader in the Senate. In the House, Speaker Lee Chatfield and Tristan Cole are the Speaker and Majority Leader, and then Representative Christine Gregg is the Minority Leader. There are other leadership positions, but those are the ones that are really critical to sort of know. And they control sort of what gets on the agenda for the legislative session. If the Speaker or the Majority Leader in the House or the Senate doesn't want something to get to the floor, they can prevent it from doing so. So there are 2 different types of legislation that can happen. One is a bill, which is traditional legislation. Bills are used to both propose and to change laws. When we start talking about public acts, and I think during the 101 we talked about the energy legislation that passed a few years ago, which was Public Act 341 and 342. Those were a series of bills first that went through the whole legislative process, and then once they go through, they become public acts. Resolutions are just expressing the opinion or will of a legislative body. They don't have to be signed by a governor. They do not become law. However, resolutions can be used, as we saw actually earlier this year, to basically, if the governor does something like an executive order, which is what happened this year, the governor had done an original executive order reorganizing the Department of Environmental Quality and the Michigan Agency on Energy, and creating an Office of Climate and an Environmental Justice Advocate Office. And in that executive order, she also tried to scale back a couple of commissions that were created by bill in the last legislative session that were giving corporations some more control over their own regulation. What the legislature did with the resolution was basically nullified the executive order, so the governor had to go back, reissue a new executive order, and leave out some of the original language, and then they allowed that to go through. So resolutions, though generally are just as an expression of will, they can be used to actually diminish the impact of an executive order. So bill process. So the first thing that happens is a bill gets introduced. So a lot of the time, we spend actually just educating legislators and talking about them about different issues that we'd like to have bills introduced about. And so if you get somebody who's a champion who's willing to take up your issue, they will work with you and legislative drafting services to write what's called a blueback, and that's essentially a draft of the bill. Then that legislator will take that bill around and try and get co-sponsors, and then we'll introduce the bill on the floor. After the bill is introduced, it gets referred to a committee, sometimes to 2 committees, but usually just 1. And that bill will then go to that assigned committee, and there will be a hearing. Rebecca Munich, who was going to do some of the talking points on PFAS, actually couldn't be on the webinar today because she's testifying at committee hearing actually on PFAS. And so Mara is covering the PFAS talking points today, but I'm sure next week you'll hear a little bit more about how that hearing went. So in committee, they take testimony and sometimes make amendments, and then they'll take a vote in the committee. And from that vote, they can either report the bill with a recommendation that it pass, or a recommendation that it not pass. They can report the bill with amendments and without a recommendation. They can take no action on the bill, so sometimes you'll have a hearing on a bill and no vote will ever be taken. Or they can also vote not to report the bill out of the committee. So what Becca's doing today, like I said, is at the committee, and she's actually submitting testimony. There are several ways you can submit testimony during a committee hearing. The easiest way is to go into the committee hearing, and there are cards at the back, and you fill them out with your name, address, phone number, email, and say what bill number you're there to support or oppose, whether you support or oppose, and whether you wish to speak. At that point, there is testimony from the experts or those introducing the bill, and then there's other formal witness testimony. Today, Becca will be giving formal testimony as basically a comment from an interested party. You can also submit written testimony, or you can put on the card that you do not wish to speak, but still your name and your position will be read into the record. So after something goes to committee, if it gets voted out with a recommendation, it goes back to the floor of whichever House or Senate you're in, and it goes to general orders and a second reading. Second reading, they just basically reiterate what the bill is. Nothing else is done generally. And then it goes to third reading, and that's usually the next day or a couple days later. And third reading and final vote. So at the time you get to third reading, each of the parties in opposition or in support will have already counted their votes, and they'll know pretty much where it's going to go at that point. And then they take a final vote, and those are recorded. If a bill passes through one of the chambers, it's then sent to the other chamber for a vote. It will also do the same process, so it will go through a committee in the other chamber. If a bill passes the second chamber but has been amended in that chamber, then it has to go back to the first chamber to either be concurred, or it can go to a committee to match up the bills. The bills have to be identical in both chambers, so then a vote would have to be taken again in the first chamber to adopt the bill as amended. It cannot pass as a law unless it's identical in both chambers. So after a bill passes out of both chambers, the governor takes action. And the governor has 14 days to consider what to do. The governor can sign the bill, which means it then becomes law or public act. The governor can veto the bill, and then the legislature could override with a 2/3 vote. but that tends to be a pretty high bar to reach. If they do reach it, then it could become law anyway without the governor's, even with the governor's veto. But unless they can reach that 2/3, the bill will just die at that point. So how do you actually get something passed? You know the process now, what it has to go through. So if you want to actually pass a piece of legislation, you need to make a plan. Think about what your legislative goal, what is the specific law that you want to have enacted? And then you have to go and think about who your legislative champions will be, who's likely to actually sponsor your bill, who's likely to co-sponsor, and consider then, which committee will hear your bill. Often you can try to write a piece of legislation. You can work with your sponsor because you aren't expected to know everything, but try and strategically figure out what the best committee to hear your bill. You can't take something that's completely off topic and put it in an off topic committee, but sometimes there are bills. I can give you an example of a couple that are going right now. There are a couple bills that have that relate to solar energy and how they will be taxed on property tax bills, and those are going through the legislature right now. Those could have either gone to like tax policy, which is where they actually went, or potentially they could have gone to the Energy Committee. They were written in such a way that they were more than likely to go to tax policy, where they had the best chance of going through. So think about which committee is going to hear your bill. And then you have to count your votes. So how many votes do you need? How many do you have to first get out of committee, and then also get out of whatever chamber you're starting in? Additionally, you want to think about what kind of press you want on this issue. Some issues you're going to want to be very vocal because you're going to get a lot of public support, and that brings pressure on the legislators. So should you do a press conference, write an editorial? But you also need to figure out who your opponents are. Do you want to, is there a big powerful lobby that you're taking on, in which case you may want to be more quiet? Or if it's something that seems pretty innocuous, just letting something go through very quietly may be a strategic move. And then you also have to figure out, is this something the governor will support? And you want to start lobbying the governor's staff early on, because the sooner you get the governor's support on, the more likely it is that she'll be willing to put some pressure on the legislature as well. So now on to lobbying. So meeting during the legislative session. Legislators are extremely busy, and they are booked solid all the time. They have a billion competing interests, trying to meet with them, trying to talk to them, trying to educate them on their different issues. And they're also trying to get reelected all at the same time. So the sooner you know that you want to meet with a legislator, you should try to schedule an appointment. Call the scheduler to set up something. There's definitely power in numbers, so if you can bring other people, especially if you have constituents, that's the best way to actually meet with a legislator. Oftentimes you'll end up meeting with staff. Do not be discouraged if you meet with staff. Staff are really critical, and you always want to be friendly with the legislative staff. Most of the time, the legislative staff have been there for years and years and years. Unlike the legislators, staff are not term limited. They may move to a different, work with a different legislator, but they have much more institutional history than the legislators often do. And so they may have a better understanding of whatever issue you're talking to them about. If, however, you really want to, just introduce yourself, you're a constituent, meet with the legislator themselves, and they weren't able to be at the specific meeting, you can always go to the Capitol building and pull them off the floor. What you do is you go outside the House or Senate chambers, and there's a card that you can fill out, and you can say, hey, I'm a constituent, my name is, I want to talk to you about this issue, and there's a sergeant at arms that comes and goes to the hallway, and you can hand him or her the card, and they will hand it to the legislator when they're on the floor. Often then the legislator will come out. We've had a few times when they've avoided us. They generally don't avoid constituents. They sometimes do avoid lobbyists. But usually the legislator will come out when there's any kind of break and at least talk to you for a few seconds. And it's good to do that just to introduce yourself. So how to actually do the visit. First thing, and these are all really basic. Show up on time and dress appropriately. I'm always asked what's appropriately. Business casual is fine. Business is also fine. As long as you're neat, and I wouldn't suggest wearing ripped up anything or t-shirt with any kind of offensive language, but you don't need to be in a suit either. Nice slacks and a blouse is fine, or a shirt. And then I would also recommend wearing some comfortable shoes, especially if you're going to be meeting with several legislators that day. It's a few blocks in between the House building and the Senate building. And if you're having lots of meetings, which we will be doing next Wednesday, you want comfortable enough shoes that you can walk back and forth quite a few times. So when you get to the meeting, just start on a positive note, introduce yourself, tell them why you're there, always be positive, do a brief presentation about who you are, why you care about this issue, know what you're going to talk about and really stick to it. Often legislators or sometimes staff will try and take you off on tangents. You want to always try to bring them back to the issue you're there to talk about. If you can personalize or localize the issues, that's really good, especially when you're talking about something within that legislator's district. Try and make it something that's really personal to them or the people that they represent. Get the legislator to talk. You should be doing a decent amount of listening as well. But like I said, you also want to make sure that they're staying relatively on topic. So if they start to talk about strange tangents, which does happen, bring them back to the issue that you were there to talk about. Always include a specific ask. If you want the legislator to support a specific issue or oppose a specific issue, after you're done with your presentation and you've had a little bit of a conversation, ask the legislator, do you support this or do you oppose this? You want to actually get an answer. Sometimes they'll dodge it, but often they will give you an answer. Sometimes they'll give you an answer that you have to somewhat decode, and that's something that sometimes takes some time to understand, but you'll have team leaders with you who will help decode any kind of vague answer that they give you. Always tell the truth. Never actually offer information that you don't know. Don't make things up. If the legislator asks you a question, it's something you don't know, that's okay. Just tell them that's not an answer you have, but you will find out and get back to them. Make sure to write down what the question is and let your team leader know, or contact somebody that you know that can get the answer, and we will get it to them. Always end on a positive note. Say thank you for your time. Appreciate your consideration of this issue. If they've given you an answer that is actually, what you wanted to hear, like, yes, I support this bill, say thank you for your support. If there's anything else I can do to help you with this issue, please let me know. And then always follow up with a thank you, even if it's with staff or legislators. Following up is really good because then they have a better chance of remembering you. Like I said, they meet with a lot of people. So just again, sort of going over the highlights, preparation is key. You want to choose who you're targeting to meet with. Do your homework, come prepared. That's why we are doing the talking points a week in advance, so you have some time to review them. Provide the legislator with facts. So if you have a fact sheet or other printed information that you can leave with them, that's always good. Next week, again, we will provide that for you to leave with a packet for each legislator. Make sure that you leave name and phone number in case they want more information. Sometimes you will also get a thank you note saying thank you for meeting with me, especially if you're a constituent. Again, just get to the point right away. Make sure you're sticking to the issue you're there to talk about. Never take anything for granted actually goes to the issue of the vague answer. So if you walk out of a meeting, you've asked specifically for their support or opposition, and you walk out and it sounds sort of like they were very friendly and very supportive, but you weren't quite sure what they said their stand was on the issue, don't take for granted that they actually gave you an answer. Like I said, we'll be there to help decode, but sometimes you actually leave with something vague, and that's intentional. And then have clear objectives as to what you're asking for. Professionalism, again, start off with an introduction, who you are, who you represent. If you're a constituent, let them know. Be assertive. Most important is don't be intimidated by them. They do work for you. They're not scary. They're really everyday people. You should never be scared to talk to a legislator. And then, if they do disagree with you, don't take it personally. It's just, you have a differing opinion on the issue. Most critical is being polite. There are times when you can have a meeting with a legislator and they're going to disagree with you and you're never going to convince them. No matter what, you want to be cordial. You can certainly present them with facts, but don't preach at them, and kind of recognize when to back off. You have to be willing to sort of tolerate that there are going to be different points of view. And the most important thing is never badmouth a legislator, especially when you're in the building. There are horror stories of people walking out of a meeting being pretty upset and, being in the elevator, going down, talking about a specific legislator, and you never know who's standing there next to you, and it will get back to them. And we've had situations where a legislator, is completely on, the opposite side. They're adversary on an issue, and then on an issue later on, they could be the best ally you could ever have. And if you've badmouthed them, if you've lied to them, they will remember and they will know, and then you lose an ally that you could have on another important issue. And then perseverance, just follow up. If they have requested other information, if they have questions that you weren't able to answer, make sure you follow up, get the information from somebody who can provide the answer, and then send it to them. And then, as I said before, always be friendly with staff. It's worth cultivating relationships with legislators' staff. Like I said, they've been there. They have, much more institutional knowledge, and they have influence over the legislator they're working for. And finally, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, and it's the only thing that ever has. One of my favorite quotes from Margaret Mead, we all can make a difference. And so you next week can actually have some serious influence over some of the legislation that's pending. And there's some really critical things going on PFAS, which Mara is going to talk about. But that's all I have.
Great, thanks, Alexis. And just a quick reminder for everyone, if you do have questions, please be sure to chat them out in the chat box. Before we go to questions, like Alexis mentioned, I am going to be going over our talking points for next week. Alexis already mentioned PFAS, that is one, but first I'm going to go over just a quick review of our basic talking points around lead. All of you should be pretty familiar since we did have our lead webinar last week. A lot of that was addressed then. I am going to do just a quick review of that before we get into our PFAS talking points, since those are the two main topics that we'll be covering next week. So as you might recall from Becca's presentation last week, she discussed some policy proposals that are currently being discussed regarding lead. One is related to Governor Whitmer's budget. Currently, they are proposing allocating $60 million to install filtered hydration stations in Michigan public schools. So what we're asking is that the state legislature should pass the supplemental budget. So this would be for 2019. That way, legislation will require filtered drinking water stations being installed in all schools, ensuring that students are then not ingesting lead. In addition to that, we are hoping for funds to be provided for the ongoing costs and maintenance, along with follow-up testing for lead and copper. So you might get some questions around that. Alexis mentioned before that you also will have team leaders, which can help if there are specific questions regarding this. Our main talking points around lead are as follows. Again, Becca did address these last week, but just quick overview of them. Big things are that lead is a large problem in Michigan, and it is a statewide crisis. We are, unfortunately, one of the worst states when it comes to rates for children poisoned by lead, and it is entirely preventable. So we really want the state of Michigan to make a commitment to end lead poisoning. You can talk a little bit about health and societal impacts, including decreases in IQ, the things related to how lead has connections to hypertension, hearing loss, osteoporosis, kidney damage, reproductive issues, and there's also increases of ADHD cases when it comes to lead poisoning in children, which is also associated with aggression, hyperactivity, and bullying. There are also economic impacts, and I mentioned that we'll be discussing a little bit more about our policy priorities, which are right here. So the first one is that we want to see testing of all children for lead poisoning. And what we mean by that, we want required free to the patient lead testing by all insurance companies. We want to increase the Medicaid reimbursement rates for lead testing and promote testing and prevention education through early childhood home visiting programs. Secondly, identifying and remediating lead hazards. So we want fully funded efforts to identify homes with lead hazards and remediate those homes. So provide resources to assist property owners to repair lead hazards in homes and prevent future exposure by requiring that residential properties receive lead clearance before rent or sale. Number 3, strengthen lead and copper rules. So we want stronger than federal and household action levels, and we want to ensure that we're setting best practice testing protocols. Another I mentioned before is regarding Governor Whitmer's supplemental budget, requiring and requesting money for filtered drinking water stations in schools. And then number 5, we want to establish a statute for a permanent lead commission. Currently, that is not in the budget. We want to ensure that that commission continues to ensure that lead poisoning in the state of Michigan is being addressed. So I know that's a really quick overview. I mentioned before that this was covered last week in the webinar, so please, if you have questions about that, you can chat them out, but also know that those materials are available. And again, you will be in groups with other fellows and a team leader, so you don't have to be the expert on every single talking point, but it is important to know that these are our big asks when it comes to lead currently, and these are the things that we'll be talking to legislators about. I mentioned, and Alexis mentioned, that another that we will be discussing is around PFAS here in Michigan. Becca mentioned and discussed PFAS in the Toxics 101 presentation that was during orientation back in March. I'm going to give a little overview of PFAS and then kind of talk about what we'll be discussing with legislators. So to start off, it's important to know that there are short and long chains of PFAS, and when we are saying PFAS, we're talking about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. There are 5,000 known PFAS substances, and currently 3,000 are found to be used for commercial use. Here are some examples of PFAS-containing products that are, a majority are a variety of coatings, including non-stick, grease and oil resistant, stain resistant, used on water repellent fabrics, can be found in firefighting foam. And there's a couple other things on the list here. So PFAS enters the environment in a few different ways. So wastewater discharge, sewage sludge, I mentioned that it's found in firefighting foam, so firefighting training runoff, and I mentioned that currently over 3,000 are found in commercial use, so another, it has to do with chemical manufacturers and industries that emit pollutants into the air and water. So you might be wondering, okay, so we know that PFAS is a problem, but what are the associated health risks with that? So there are various health risks associated with PFAS, including osteoarthritis, low birth weights, preterm birth, ADHD, other reproductive health problems, including becoming pregnant. It's related to certain types of cancers, so including testicular cancer, kidney, also kidney disease, thyroid disease, suppressed immune responses, delayed puberty. As you can see, it's a pretty long list of different related health complications that have been associated with PFAS. Another thing to know is PFAS has been detected in human blood, semen, and breast milk, and PFAS can cross the placenta, exposing unborn children. And as I mentioned, because PFAS can cross the placenta, some of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to PFAS are pregnant women, unborn fetuses, and newborns. So I mentioned before the ways in which PFAS enters the environment. We'll now look at some examples of contamination sites here in Michigan. First one being in Oscoda. We mentioned before firefighting foam. It has been found in Oscoda, Michigan, and the firefighting foam has contaminated the groundwater. Other bases that have found contamination in Michigan include Selfridge, Battle Creek, Sawyer, Alpena, and Camp Grayling. Another way that it has gotten into the environment is through wastewater discharge. An example of that is the Huron River watershed. And so a couple of the different reasons that it's ended up in the wastewater discharge include manufacturing. Other potential sources are also still being investigated there. Chemical manufacturing and industries is another example that we're seeing here in Michigan. One of the sites is in Rockford, Michigan, related to the Wolverine plant. They were using chemicals at that plant to make shoes waterproof that have now ended up in water supplies. Kent Lake watershed is another, and really what's been happening there is drinking water from groundwater wells have become contaminated. Chemical and manufacturing industries, Parchment, Michigan, I mentioned before, has been a contamination site. This is due to surface and well water contamination. Mentioned in Battle Creek in the Kalamazoo area. So Kalamazoo River runs around a landfill for dumped paper-making waste, which has resulted in contamination there. And as you can see, there's a list of some of the various companies that unfortunately have been involved in this contamination. So MPART does have drinking water initiatives out, testing drinking waters from all schools that are on well water. So 938 samples from community water supplies have also been taken. As you can see, Parchment Public Water Supply in Kalamazoo has been tested, and then 300 samples from schools on wells have also been tested. Another component and concern are fish contamination here in the state of Michigan. You may have seen some of the Eat Safe Fish advisories. I know just here in Ann Arbor, walking by the Huron River, there are several signs that are very well placed so that people know not to be eating the fish. And some of these advisories have been happening for years. So for example, like in Clark Marsh and Lower Osable, they've had advisories since 2012. So when it comes to PFAS and regulation, it's currently not regulated under the Toxic Substance Control Act. It's not listed as under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, and it's not listed as a Superfund hazardous substance. Currently, it's also not regulated by the EPA and only has an advisory level that is not currently enforceable. So since currently there is nothing that's really enforceable at the federal level, there are things that communities are doing to take action and to address PFAS. So for example, in Ann Arbor, back in 2018, the city passed a procurement policy that prohibited the purchasing of products that contain PFAS and other toxic chemicals. So I mentioned before that there are a lot of different products that contain PFAS due to the different coatings and waterproofing. And so the city has made it one of their goals to ensure that they are not purchasing any products that contain PFAS. The fire department and water treatment facility have also worked together to remove PFAS firefighting foam and have also taken the steps to identify other types of firefighting foam that are free of PFAS for the city to use. The city's water treatment facility has installed filters, specifically granulated activated carbon filters for drinking water, and they've continued to test the water in the Huron River. So there have been things that have been introduced here at the state level as well. So just last month, in March, Governor Whitmer directed the Department of Environmental Quality, which is now the department, or now has a new name, no longer the DEQ, Alexis mentioned before that whole process, but they have began a process to set health protective maximum contaminant levels for 5 PFAS in drinking water. They're considering sensitive endpoints for each PFAS. They want to make sure that they're protecting the most vulnerable populations that I mentioned before, which include babies and pregnant women. And they see that the previous 70 parts per trillion action level is too weak. So earlier this month, on April 4th, a new health screening levels for drinking water in Michigan have been set. So as you can see, for the 5 PFAS, they're the different maximum contaminant levels or screening levels that they're looking at currently. Other state policy proposals that are currently being discussed have to do, that are being discussed currently in the state legislature. Alexis mentioned earlier that Becca is currently providing testimony related to these bills. One has to do with the banning of firefighting foams that contain PFAS chemicals. I mentioned before that there's been issues around contamination in groundwater regarding firefighting foam from bases that include PFAS. So one of the things they want to do is establish a take-back program for foam that does include PFAS, and they want to ensure that firefighters and that the foam they're using are the safer alternatives. Another thing that we're looking at is ensuring that all state purchasing eliminates the purchase of PFAS-containing products. So I mentioned that this is something that the city of Ann Arbor has done with their procurement policy. This is something that we're hoping to have done statewide. Other things that are being discussed are providing adequate funding to continue testing for PFAS chemicals, ensuring that contaminated sites are remediated, providing treatment funds for water facilities and private well users to ensure that they're providing safe drinking water, and provide medical monitoring to impacted communities that have already been dealing with PFAS contamination. Another thing that we would like to see is creating a publicly available database and maps of all known sites of contamination for PFAS and other contaminants. We want to ensure that test results are available as they're being received as well. That way the communities and the public are well aware of where PFAS contamination has been found and what exactly those test results are showing. And so with that, that is our last bit around policy priorities. But now I want to see if folks have questions. So we're going to open it up and see if any folks have questions regarding how to meet with a legislator, or if they have specific questions regarding talking points for next week. Be sure to get those questions in. But Alexis, I was hoping one of the things that you could talk a little bit about has to do with when meeting with legislators. Is there anything specifically that fellows need to make sure that they bring with them? Are there any requirements to get into the buildings for meetings?
Yes. Everybody needs to bring some form of picture ID with them, either state ID, driver's license. It used to be that you could get into the Senate building without ID, but now you need ID for both. You'll have to show it once in each building, and you'll get a visitor sticker pass. But they will not let you in to the building or into the offices unless you have a picture ID with you. So that's really critical. Otherwise, we will be providing talking points for you. But I think one of the things that everybody should try and do is think about sort of their first pitch when they're introducing themselves. Your team leader will say, hi, we're here with the Ecology Center health leaders, and say 2 or 3 words about, what the health leader program is, but then introduce yourself with, a title, where you work, and sort of why you are doing the health fellowship. And then, that can lead into why you care about, these issues, lead and PFAS. So yeah, just think about sort of what you want to say in your introduction over the next week.
Yeah, great tips, Alexis. You kind of mentioned this before, but I was wondering if you could go and give people a couple different options when it comes to if a legislator is asking questions that are kind of, out there, or as health professionals, we might not have the answers. Are there different tactics you can take of how you can kind of either, bring them back to the focus, or kind of how to let them know what it is that you're really there to talk about if they kind of keep going off topic?
Sure. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes, especially if it's a topic they want to avoid, and they have figured out something that connects you. I've had legislators start talking about their daughter's wedding to somebody because they knew somebody who was there, and so try and sort of respect what they're saying. Say yeah, it's great, and I really, it's great that we have that connection. We know that person. And then just bring them back. And, if you can think of a way to actually connect it back, Jimmy's cousin actually lives near this contaminated water site, which is another reason why, we really want to talk about PFAS and, how it impacts your community. The other thing, that's for sort of bringing it back to topic when they go off on a tangent. If there's a question that they ask and you don't have the answer, you can, do a quick glance at the talking points to see if the answer's in there. Like I said, your team leaders will have, a little bit more information. So, we can try and jump in if it's something a little more complicated, but we don't know everything either. So it is absolutely okay to say, I do not have the answer to that, but I will, make sure to check with somebody and get back to you. As long as you do the follow-up and, try and get them the answers there, to the questions they're asking, it is absolutely okay to say there's something that you don't know. Never try and make up a fact.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Just one other question. This is regarding just kind of the way that the day will run. How much time do you generally get with the legislator?
Well, as I had said in the earlier part of the presentation, they are extremely busy. They have 1,000 people asking them for meetings every day. They have committee hearings that for committees they serve on, and they have the legislative session. And then they also have their lives outside of the legislature. So really during the legislative session, if you get half an hour, it's incredible. Most of the time you get about 15 minutes. So that means you have to go and do your introduction, make your pitch, ask your question, all within that 15-minute time frame. So just, and be conscious of the time. If you're on the schedule for half an hour, you often can, actually, get that, but, sometimes you'll actually be on the schedule for 15 minutes and then you have to just boom, 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 like right through all of your points. If you're on the schedule for half an hour, still be really mindful of the time. Don't try and draw out a meeting if there's not anything more to say. Just say, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your consideration. If there's any other questions I can answer for you, please let me know. I'll get back to you on the questions I couldn't answer. But let them know that you know how busy they are and that you are appreciative that they have taken the time to listen to you, and then get out of there. They will remember that you gave them 5 minutes back of their day.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions coming in right now, but if folks do have questions after today's webinar, or if you review materials and then notice that there's something that came up that you do have a question about, feel free to reach out to Alexis or myself. I'm putting our email addresses out in the chat box now. That way we can address any questions you do have before next week. Alexis mentioned handouts that we'll be providing for legislators. Those are up on our website now. I'll be sending out those links again later this afternoon once the webinar recording is available. But other than that, main things to remember after today's presentation, we do have an evaluation. The evaluation is required for all current Health Leaders Fellows. However, we also strongly encourage all other participants to complete the survey as well. Your feedback is really valuable in planning future meetings. So you can see that link there now. And like we mentioned, our next event will take place a week from tomorrow on Wednesday, May 8th. We'll be at the Capitol meeting with legislators to discuss the importance of health when it comes to environmental policy, specifically regarding ending childhood lead poisoning and PFAS contamination. I've heard from a majority of fellows. However, if you have not yet confirmed your attendance, please do so as soon as you can with me. That way we can make sure that you're placed in a group with a team leader and have meetings for next week. But other than that, thanks again for joining us for today's webinar, and we're really excited to see everyone next week in Lansing.
Thank you.